With me this morning to the Gospel of Matthew. So we continue our study in the living Word. That is the Word God intends to live in and through each one of us. That truth, that sensibleness that is resident in each believer and seen by the world. Now, there's been a lot said this morning about glory. And glory is when God gets His way in your life and mine, and people see it in us. They see it in us. Then His manifestation is present in the midst of men. The living Word. Simply yes and no. That's the title of the message today. And oh, that we as individuals, as a church, as a country could get back to the place where we could let our yes be yes and our no be no. And that be enough. Can you imagine the litigation that would be lost if people would just let their yes be yes and their no be no? This morning, I started to name this particular teaching loopholes. Have y'all ever heard that word, loopholes? Doesn't really matter where you are with or apart from maybe the NRA, whichever your position. But gun control and the Second Amendment and all those things have created what they call a backdoor loophole. Now, what I mean by that is that people go to gun shows. And when they go to the gun shows, they see all these guns, and they possibly want to purchase one of those guns. But you see, in order to purchase a gun legally, you've got to go through a background check. John Malco, one of our deacons and one of my beloved friends, has a pawn shop. One of the few that I really feel good about entering, and knowing its owner and his honesty and integrity. If his pastor wants to buy a gun, and I have bought some guns from John, love to hunt, and John says, "Okay, Pastor, fill this out." You know, so I have to fill out and go through the call in of the information and do the background check so I can purchase the gun. But if you're at a gun show and you see a gun that you like, and there are a lot of folks that do, and they don't want to go through the background check, the backdoor loophole is, you know, I like that gun, and this is the price I would pay for that gun, and I'm going to be by my car out in the parking lot in 15 minutes. And many guns are exchanged just like that. Now see, it's not totally wrong, but then it's not totally right either. Because if I go and I buy a gun from a person, there is no background check. But if I buy it from a registered dealer, then they are required by law to do a background check. But if they go out in the back, outside the door, you have a backdoor loophole. I want to tell you this morning, when it comes to the Lord, there are no loopholes. You understand what I'm saying? I had some folks comment when we recently did this study about all these subjects that Jesus is addressing. You've heard it said of them, but I say to you, and they said, well, Pastor, you know, when you did that section on adultery and you did that section on divorce, you didn't tell the folks that you had been through a divorce yourself. Guess what? I praise God, it's been so long, I didn't even think about doing that. I don't hesitate to say it one way or the other, but let me tell you what, about 23, 24 years ago, I went through the horrors of divorce. Okay? And I'm glad to say you as a church did something. I could not find a church anywhere that was Southern Baptist that I knew of that had ever done it. One, you didn't fire me or dismiss me. Two, you walked with me through it. You loved me as I went through a year of dating my wife now of 21 years. And you loved her, and you've continued to love us and our children, and we have a blended family. And I tell you all that just to kind of help those folks that heard that last week. I want to be sure that you know that. I am not proud of that, but I am proud of how God's grace and how your loving grace redeemed me and supported me in and through that. But while I was going through this, I already had my theological degree. I already had my understanding of what it meant to go through divorce. I had all those things in my mind, but it really brought them into a question. So I went back and I began to read everything from the far right to the far left that was written on divorce, marriage, and divorce and marriage or remarriage, okay? And I'm not going to call the guy's name because if I did, some of you know him and he might be a fan of yours. And if you've read his book, I like a lot that he does, but on this particular point, I think he is absolutely incorrect. Now, I thought that before I ever read it, but I want to tell you about a loophole. This is how he dealt with marriage, divorce, and remarriage. He said, well, the first thing you do, any of y'all ever had difficulty in a relationship? Besides me? Oh, come on now. Everyone, and I know some of you are not raising your hand because I've talked to you and I know you had difficulties in a relationship. And so the way he would handle it, first he'd say, well, he'd go back to Matthew 18. He said, you got a problem with a person? You got aught against a person? Well, if you're at the point of dissolving a marriage relationship, you got problems. But by the time you get there, the other person usually is not ready to listen to anything you've got to say, and probably vice versa. It's already a broken deal, a broken communication. But you're supposed to go to them, he said, and tell them. Well, you've already told them. You've argued about it. You've fought about it. All this stuff has already gone on. But then he says, but then you take the next step. Right out of Matthew 18, you take a witness with you. And you go and see them. Because that's what the Bible said, one or two witnesses. And if they won't hear them, now if you show up and you're in that kind of a disarray with someone, are they going to listen to those other two people? Maybe. Not probable, but possible. And then if they don't hear those two, what are you supposed to do? Oh, some of y'all read, take it to the church. And then if you don't have a hearing and an understanding at that point, and the person's still not ready to resolve the relationship, what do you do to them? You treat them as what? An unbeliever. And then he runs over into Paul, and he picks up another passage. Now, what I was taught in my education process, this is what you call proof texting. This is also eisegesis. You're reading into the passage. So he goes and he gets another passage and he says, well, you know, if you're married and now you are attached to an unbeliever, because you've made them by going through that process, what? An unbeliever. Then you can divorce them biblically. You know what I have to say to that? Bull. You know why? Because that's a religious loophole. For someone who's trying to live with a rule and regulation and violate the ideal of God, God designed marriage for one woman, for one man, for life. And anything less than the ideal, God hates. And all you have to do is be a person who goes through that terrible, horrific thing called divorce to know it tears up people. It tears up innocent children. It breaks relationships and families across the board. God's not playing games with us. And if ever there was a serious moment, He's saying what you say and when you say it and oaths you take are important to God, and He expects you to keep them. Now, you can use that and drive right into today's passage and read with me, if you will. In verse 33, it says in chapter 5 of Matthew about oaths. He says, again, you have heard it was said to people long ago, do not break your oath, but fulfill to the Lord the vows you have made. Now, has everybody got your pencil out? I'm not going to take the time to go here and read this because our time is short and I want to be sure we get through these points. So write down Leviticus 19:12 and write down Exodus 27. Now, as you would know, in Exodus 27, you're going to one of the Ten Commandments, and it has to do with not misusing the name of the Lord, which most of the time people take as using God's name in a curse word. It isn't that that isn't happening, but that's a small part of what's happening. It's more about agreements and contracts and taking oaths and vows. And what Jesus has done is He took that same teaching out of Leviticus, or the teaching of the religious pastors of the day. That's who the Levites were. They were those priests Ron was talking about. I always found it interesting when they got ready for people to practice their faith, and there is a raging river, who gets pushed in first? I just really wanted to stand up and say that. Joshua didn't go first. They sent the preachers first. I don't know, maybe they thought, well, we can do without them, but, they're not very good at battle anyway. But I don't know. Y'all laugh. That's supposed to be funny. Goodness gracious. But anyway, it has nothing to do with the sermon. But I did want to laugh just for a minute about that. I didn't get to check Ron on it. But anyway, when we move in that direction, he says, don't break oaths, but fulfill to the Lord the vows you have made. Now, if you go and you read those two, what Jesus did is He took the two and put them together, and what you have in the text here is a summary of Him gathering up two biblical pieces and saying that publicly to the audience. All of them would have known exactly where what He said came from about both oaths and vows. Now, when I said that in verse 33, under point 1, I had implicit or explicit. Now, the difference is some things are implied and some things are very, very black and white. And so I use those two words, implicit or explicit, because when it comes to an oath, which has to do, and that word literally has abiding character. If you break an oath, it messes with who you are. I can tell you, when I went through my divorce, I had an oath to God that I would do all of these things, and there were a lot of other things that I didn't know about when I made that were going on, and my life was in a mess. But it doesn't matter what mess there is or what reason there is. When you go through it, it affects who you are. And it affected me. And it affected all those folks around me. It affected our church. And so, there are some things that are explicit, but then there is that swear falsely, which has to do with an attempt to strengthen a powerless position. Now, it doesn't matter whether it is a direct rule or if it's one that is understood from the heart. It doesn't matter whether it is implicit or explicit. Jesus is saying, you are accountable for what you do. Now, why do we buttress? Now, just in case you missed my southern in this, that's something you do to support something that's weak or that you suppose won't withstand the pressure that's coming. Why do you stack up stuff to hold things up that are weak when you make comments about your allegiance to a certain truth or a promise. Well, now that you kind of have that confused look, it's the great place to drop the illustration. I swear on there we are, a stack of Bibles. As though your oath, your swearing, your word is not enough. And you want to build that up by saying, well, here, not just one Bible. I promise to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help me God. No, I'm so weak in my position, I need a stack of Bibles. But, you know, when somebody says that, I want to take about 2 steps back and say, I'm not really sure about this. You know, somehow that position is compromised, and there's a weakness when we feel like we've got to do one thing to make it seem legitimate, when in reality it is already in question by how we did it. And what the Pharisees were doing is they were saying, well, I swear by the gold on the altar. I swear by heaven. I swear by earth. I swear by my head. As though you haven't invoked the name of God. And so what happened there was because they didn't bring God's name into it, they weren't really responsible for keeping their word and their promise. And Jesus says that's foolishness. That's absolute foolishness. In fact, in the next one I have implication from implicate, which has to do with criminal, okay? And veneration, which has to do with regard and reverence. You've got to check your motive. Are you in there because you want to in some way make God implicated in your treachery by using something holy, but you've taken the time to be subversive and take his name out so you're not responsible for what you promised? See, that's what he's talking about here. He's talking about a loophole. And when he turns around and he says to them, you can read it, do not break your oath, but fulfill to the Lord the vows you have made. But I tell you, Jesus says, do not swear an oath at all. Now, what's he talking to us about? He's talking to us about a new way of living and a new way of thinking if we're going to be citizens of the kingdom. That place where he is the sovereign, where he rules in his reign. No more deception, no more lies, no more foolery. A simple yes and a simple no. And you mean yes if you say yes, and you mean no if you say no. And so he says, either by heaven, for it is God's throne, or by earth, for it is God's footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the King. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make even one hair white or black. Interesting. Go over to Matthew 23. Look at verse 16. These words are in the section called the 7 woes. But in verse 16 it says, woe to you blind guides! You say, if anyone swears by the temple, it means nothing. But if anyone who swears by the gold on the temple, he is bound by that oath. You blind fools, which is greater, the gold or the temple that makes the gold sacred? You also say, if anyone swears by the altar, it means nothing. But if anyone swears by the gift on the altar, then they're bound by that oath. You blind men, which is greater, the gift or the altar that makes the gift sacred? Therefore, anyone who swears by the altar swears by it and by everything on it. And anyone who swears by the temple swears by it and by the one who dwells in it. And anyone who swears by heaven swears by God's throne and by the one who sits on the throne. Friend, God is there all the time, seeing and knowing your heart. He doesn't care about how you mix up your words to make yourself either feel less or more liable for what you have promised and what you have said you would do. In fact, I think what the simple message through this is quit playing games with God. He already knows. You know, that's one of the things when couples come and they sit and we visit, and I can tell real quick when they start kind of nipping at each other in the counseling office, they enter some kind of a game. You know, they begin to compete for who's right and who's wrong. And when it comes to you and I and God, it's real easy. He's always right. And you will always be wrong. Rick Warren said it so well. We need to deal with rational lies. Those things that we say to buttress, build up what we already know are wrong. He says, stop that. Your motive, whether it is to take it as a commandment, as he listed in Matthew 15, 1 through 20, or if you even go back and look at the wise man who said, don't do this, in the book of Proverbs 29 and 24, it is wrong to make it a commandment or an oath and misuse it. In fact, let's read Mark 7, 11, where he talks about an oath. In Mark 7 and verse 11, look what they were doing with this misuse. And let's begin in verse 9. And he continued, you have a fine way of setting aside the commandments of God in order to observe your own traditions. You got a fine way of taking the Bible, making it say what you want it to say, so you can do what you want to do. That's a Georgian translation. But I think that's pretty accurate and close. Okay? And anyone, he says, who curses their father or their mother is to be put to death. But you say that if anyone declares that what might have been used to help their father or their mother is Corban, that is, devoted to the Lord, then you no longer let them do anything for their father or their mother. Thus, you have nullified the word of God by your tradition that you have handed down, and you do many things like that. When you start down that road, you'll start doing more of it. Now, you think it's something that you shouldn't say a bad thing to a parent, and if you caught people doing that, you'd kill them. He said, it's much worse for you to say, I'm doing what I'm doing, which is terrible, not taking care of my responsibilities, especially to those who birthed me and brought me into this world, and saying, I'm justified in that by the fact that I've devoted all of this to God. You can almost hear the churchese in their voice when they do that. And so, with that said, we move from motive to modus operandi. MO, as we call it. Now, I don't know if any of y'all would take the time to look that word up and know that it's Latin. But what it means is the method of operation. How do you operate? Do you operate with a simple yes and no? Or do you cause confusion and convolute your message so you can manipulate the situation to suit you? And so he's saying, what is your method of operation? Well, the religious leaders, they were saying, well, I swear by heaven, I swear by earth, I swear by Jerusalem, I swear by my head, as though they didn't really have to keep their yes and no or their promises. In fact, they were devouring widows' houses. That's what they were accused of. They were coming in, they were offering legal advice, swearing on heaven, swearing on the earth, swearing on this and that. And that poor widow thought, not only were they in here helping me with legal advice, they've done this by a godly gesture, and so they signed off only to find out they took their house. They took their money. You hear anything like that in religious news these days? I remember my pastor friend who was furious with a big name TV evangelist who lived in a 400-acre plot of land with a huge mansion and brick walls all the way around his 400 acres. And his mother, who was living on Social Security, called and she didn't have money to pay her bills, and she wanted help for her preacher's son. And he said, well, Mother, where? Because he helped her work out her budget, and he saw to it she had what she needed. And where is the money we set aside for you to pay those bills? Oh, I sent them to so-and-so. He told me if I'd do this, that he'd do this for me, and he'd heal this in me, and he'd give me this, and I'd get all this from God. You know what? That's foolery. He said, don't get wrapped up in that stuff. Now, I'm not against people giving to ministries. I'm not against people helping other people. But folks, be sure they have a clear message from God. And their yes is yes and their no is no. Don't check your gray matter when you enter the sanctuary, because you will get caught and made a fool of. So, with that said, what is your method of operation? Theirs was to trick and to mislead and misuse. Write down this passage here and look again in Matthew 15, 1 through 20, where it talks about all of that. And so, with that, we look not only at the religious leaders, but then we look at Christ. What did Christ do? Christ spoke the truth. Christ taught the truth. Christ lived the truth. And Christ died because he was the truth. And folks, he's coming back again in all truth to judge the living and the dead. And that's when his truth is going to raise you and me from the grave. Yeah, somebody ought to clap about that. So you got to determine, are you going to serve the kingdom of God or the kingdom of this world? Jesus said it's as simple as this. Let your yes be yes. Let your no be no. The duplicity that we get into is when we begin to accentuate one characteristic that is inferior to another. The characteristic of what we take into our mouth. Jesus really says, you know, what a person ingests, what he brings into his mouth, is really not that important. It's kind of trivial and slight. And yet they had all these rules and regulations about what they could eat and what they could drink and what they could do and what they couldn't do. And that's what they were fussing at Jesus' disciples with. It's because they were hungry in the field and they went out and they got some corn and they started eating. But because they didn't wash their hands, they were defiled. And yet he said to them, you blind leaders of the blind, you strain a gnat. I want you to stop and think about what he's talking about. They're using their teeth as a filtering system. You know, because you see, in their belief and their tradition, if you ingest a bug, you're spiritually defiled. And when they crushed the grapes to make the wine, the bugs got in the wine. And so that they wouldn't risk being spiritually defiled when they drank their wine, instead of just drinking it like most folks would, they drank the wine through clenched teeth. So they would eliminate any bugs from getting in. It is spiritually wrong to eat bugs. I just want you to know that. So if you don't have a bug diet, you're doing good, okay? But what Jesus was going to do is use a drastic example, a hyperbolic example, one that was full of extreme exaggeration. And what he would say is you strain a gnat so you don't get spiritually defiled, and then you turn around and you swallow a camel. You know, you can't swallow a camel. It's absurd. And about the time they said that, can't you hear Jesus say it? Right! What you're doing is absurd. Anytime you try to think that you can fool others and fool God and get away with it, he said, let your yes be yes and your no be no. You do things above board, and you do things in such a way that you not only not do what's wrong, you do everything above anybody even being able to think you're right or wrong. You make sure you go to the fullest extent. Well, Cicero, the great orator of Hellenism, said this: nothing is sweeter than the light of truth. How interesting. Because Jesus said of you and I that belong to him, you are the light of the world. Let your light so shine before men that when they see the light of God that's in you, they glorify your Father who is in heaven. Get out of the ego trip. Get out of the terror and the fear of personal striving and stress in life and live for Christ. And when you do, the light of Christ that's in you will affect those around you, and you become a manifestation of his presence. His glory is literally in the presence of men and women. So, 3 things I want to ask you to do in light of this text. First, 1, be sure you're called by God. In the book of John, that great beloved disciple writes these words: no one comes to Jesus unless they come with the Father drawing them. So the first thing I want to be sure of with every one of you and with myself, has God called you and I sinners to his gracious table to redeem us and set us free? The second thing about that call is once you are called, you are attached to a local group of believers. Are you called to be a member of this church? And if you are, then be a member of this church and support it and be committed. And if not, then go somewhere where you can be committed. But be in the Lord's church as a physical part of his body and be committed because you know you're called there. When I talk to a person about joining this church, I say, we'd love to have you. I'd love for you to be a part of this church, but the most important decision you need to make is God calling you to this church? That way, if someone within this body does something just asinine, you won't run off. Because God called you here. And you're not going to leave here till God leads you or calls you someplace else. So, be sure you're called by God. Second, be sure you live for God. Be sure you live for God. Joshua said it this way: choose you this day whom you will serve. But as for me and my house, we're going to serve the Lord. Be sure you choose how you're going to live. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. Don't be convoluted. And finally, all of us have trouble. Every one of us has trouble when it comes to our call and to our living of that call. So rely on God. Rely on God. Ephesians 2, 8 and 10. For by grace, you see, it's his unmerited favor that makes it possible. For by grace you've been saved through faith. It's not of yourself. He knows us. We'd brag about it. It's not of yourself. It's the gift of God, not of works, because you would boast. You are God's workmanship, created in Christ Jesus unto good works. Folks, the reason God saved you and called you is so that you could live for him and rely on his grace, that you might be just like his Son and be a manifestation of his presence in the midst of men. And how our world needs that, how our churches need that. So I want you to stand this morning as we dismiss, and I want you to listen with hopefully New Year's to a prayer you all know. The first part of the prayer, reverence God. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Leave here committed to reverence God. Leave here determined to put God first. Make him the priority. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. How and where? In and through you and me. The third thing, trust God. Give us this day our daily bread. And then, the fourth thing, God's grace. You have debts and transgressions? Live it. Forgive those who have debts and transgressions against you. You can't do either one of those without grace. And finally, rely on God. Don't allow me into temptation. Deliver me from evil. And then the benediction. For yours is the power and the glory forever and ever. Amen and amen. Folks, it's as simple as this. Let your yes be yes. Let your no be no. You're dismissed. Thank you for your presence.